A black pregnant woman named Sandra was punched by a racist police officer, Wally. How will this encounter change both of their lives forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sandra's hands were shaking as she stood next to her car. Her heart was beating fast. The quiet, empty road she had been driving on moments before was hit hard by the late afternoon sun. Nothing moved at all after Officer Wally's squad car pulled up behind her. It was like the world had stopped. She felt scared as the flashing blue lights mirrored in her rearview mirror. This was not meant to happen. There was nothing wrong with her. She put her hand on her stomach and gently stroked the small bump that had grown over the past few months. Every choice she made at that point wasn't just for herself. It was for her future child as well. Sandra took a shallow breath as she turned to face the officer. She was thinking about all the things she had learned about how to stay cool around police. Be polite, cooperate, and don't move quickly. But there was something off about Officer Wally as he walked up. He had clamped teeth and cold eyes. He kept his hand on the holster on his hip. He gave off an obvious hostile vibe as soon as he got out of his car. Sandra could feel the stress in the air, which told her that something bad was about to happen. He barked, "License and registration," and his voice was cold and unprofessional. Sandra fumbled nervously as she quickly pulled the papers out of her bag. She moved slowly and carefully, because she knew how quickly things could get worse. She gave him the papers with shaky hands. I wasn't speeding," Sandra stuttered, as she tried to figure out why she had been stopped. It was very slow for her because she was thinking about the baby and the quiet life growing inside her. Something had to be wrong. Wally looked quickly at her registration and then fixed his eyes on her, staring so hard that Sandra's skin crawled. "Get out of the car," he told them in a harsh, demanding voice. Sandra stopped moving, and her heart skipped a beat. "Take a step outside the car?" Why? She did all the right things. She didn't need to get out of the car. She wasn't dangerous. I'm pregnant," she said softly, putting her hand on her stomach again, as if to tell him to see her as a person. He didn't seem to care though. Wally took a step closer and yelled, "Get out of the car." He moved his hand to his belt and put it on the baton that was hanging around his waist. In his eyes, there was neither sympathy nor understanding. There was only cold, pure power. Sandra's mind and heart beat faster. What was going on? What was making him so angry? She forced herself not to worry as she swallowed hard. Things were going badly in the first 10 seconds of this meeting, and she knew that one more quick move could make things worse. She took a deep breath and told herself to stay cool and steady. Her voice, "Please," Sandra begged. "I don't understand. Why are you asking me to step out of the car? I haven't done anything wrong." Wally's face turned tough, and his lip curled in disgust. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said. "Step out of the car, or I'll make you get out." Sandra felt a chill go down her spine when she heard his words. Once she knew this wasn't a normal stop, she felt scared. The tone was private. It wasn't about the law. The way he looked at her, it had to do with power. This cop had already decided what to do with her before he even asked for her license. She was black and driving alone on a quiet road. He wasn't interested in hearing why. Only to tell her who was in charge. He wasn't interested in her at all. The fact that she was weak hit her like a wave of weight. There was a life inside her that she was carrying, but it didn't seem to bother him. His goal was to kill her, not a person. That scared her more than anything else. Sandra didn't want to do it, but she reached for the door handle and pushed it open. Her fingers were shaking as she got out of the car. She stood as tall as she could, even though her legs were weak. She kept her hand on her stomach the whole time. "Sandra, don't worry. Do not let him hurt you." Wally moved closer to her as soon as she got out of the car, making his big body tower over her. Sandra naturally moved back, but he did the same, closing the space between them. As he looked her over and over, his lips were curled into a sneer, and his eyes were cold. "What are you hiding?" Wally growled, keeping his hand close to his gun in a risky way. Sandra felt her heart beating fast. Why did he talk like that? There was nothing she was hiding. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, and her voice shook. I'm just trying to go home." Wally didn't listen, though. He had already decided. He thought she did something wrong and would make her pay for it. He got even closer and his voice got low and scary. "Don't lie to me. I know your type. You people think you can get away with anything, don't you?" Sandra's eyes got really big in shock. That kind of person. The words hurt her very much. It wasn't just that she was pulled over. It had to do with her skin color. He didn't think she was human, and the thought of that made her feel sick. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said in a whisper, so quiet that everyone could hear her. She wanted to run away from this man who made fun of her because she was different, but she couldn't move. She stayed where she was because she was afraid and powerless. Wally moved forward one more time, and now his face was just inches away from hers. "You think being pregnant is going to get you out of this?" he said. "You think I care about your little sob story?" Sandra couldn't get her breath out. He spoke with the cold, mean voice that she had never heard before. She had always known racism existed, but this was the first time she had seen it straight out in the open. It was very scary. She blinked back tears as they came up in her eyes. "Do not cry. Do not show fear. It will only be used against you," Sandra said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to get home." She wasn't asking for mercy, but for kindness. So this man could see her as a person who deserves respect and honor. Wally, on the other hand, only laughed, and the sound of it made her cold. "You're not going anywhere," he told her as he reached for her baton and tightly gripped it. "Get on the ground, now." Sandra's heart stopped. On the ground? She looked at her swollen stomach and then back at him in shock. "I can't," she said, in a struggling voice. "I'm pregnant, please." Wally lost his cool and yelled, "I said get on the ground." You could feel the rage in his voice. It was like it was about to boil over at any moment. He was done with games. He did not care what it took to get her down. Sandra's legs were shaking as she tried to figure out what was going on. This isn't real. This is not possible. It was, though, and she was by herself. She could see that the road behind them was empty and barren. There were no one nearby to help or see what was going to happen. Her mind begged her to run away from this man who didn't seem to care about her safety. But she couldn't. Where would she go? The first 10 seconds of this encounter were scary, but now that Wally was standing over her and telling her to get on the ground, those 10 seconds felt like they were running out quickly, and something much worse was about to happen. Sandra was still, and her eyes were fixed on Wally as he tightened his grip on the staff. She had no choice. She had to give in. But as she bent down to kneel, she felt a sharp, unbearable cramp in her stomach that made her gasp for air. As the pain got worse, she grabbed her stomach in fear. The child. There was a problem. Wally looked at her with cold eyes, not caring that she looked like she was upset. He kept saying, "I said get on the ground," in a very strong voice. Sandra couldn't, though. She was having a hard time breathing. It hurt too much. She reached for her phone with shaking hands and called the only number she could think of. She prayed as the phone rang. She needed help. Sandra stood by the side of the road with one hand across her swollen belly to cover it. Her heart was beating fast. Officer Wally's squad car's bright red and blue lights cast scary shapes around them. But all she could think about was how scared she was getting. As the cop walked up to her, her heart rate went up, and his face turned angry. Why did he stop her? Even though she hadn't done anything wrong, things were getting out of hand. Officer Wally stood taller than her and put his hand on his gun holster as if she were a danger. He didn't care about what she had to say, and laughed off her answers. When he gave directions, his voice was harsh and full of put-downs. "Get on the ground, now." Sandra had a hard time breathing. "Officer, please, I'm pregnant," she said, trying to stay cool, even though she knew things were getting worse. She made a sign to her apparent baby bump, hoping he'd understand that putting her on the ground wasn't only pointless, it was also risky. He wouldn't do that, surely. What Wally did, though, was make his face darker and his eyes narrow, as if what she said was a challenge to his power. No matter how she tried to explain herself or how pregnant she was, he didn't care. He was already sure she was guilty of something, and her efforts to talk to him, calm down, only made him more angry. Yelled, "I told you to get on the ground," and grabbed her arm tightly. Sandra gasped and stumbled a little as Wally pulled her down the sidewalk. She immediately clutched her stomach as pain shot through her abdomen. Her mind was racing with fear for her unborn child. Now, Wally couldn't miss the fear in her eyes, but she didn't seem to notice or care. Things were getting worse, and it felt like everything was happening slowly, like a bad dream that was going on all the time. People walking by had seen the bright lights and heard the yelling, and a small crowd began to form. As their fears grew, some of them took out their phones and started recording what they saw. A pregnant black woman who is being SX'd by a white police officer. No one spoke up to stop it yet, even though it was wrong. People didn't want to get involved in something that could get bad because the air was tense. Sandra's mind was racing, and her thoughts were a crazy mix of fear and doubt. This is not likely to happen. Being stressed out about the last few weeks of her pregnancy was getting in the way of her driving home from work. Suddenly, a man who was meant to protect her threw her to the ground. Wally pulled her arm behind her back and pushed her down, making her hurt. The pressure made her knees buckle a little, and she cried out in pain. Her voice cracked as she fought to stay standing and protect her baby from the force of the fall. "Please, you're hurting me," she begged. He didn't stop, though. Every second that went by, his grip got tighter and his face got more serious. "Stop resisting," he growled, as if he was sure she was a criminal who needed to be restrained. But Sandra wasn't fighting back. She was just trying to protect herself and her child. Her words showed that she was scared, but Wally seemed to get even more angry. People in the crowd whispered in shock and confusion, and some moved closer to get a better look at what was going on. One or two people said, "She's pregnant," but Wally either didn't hear or didn't care. He already knew what he wanted to do. He was in charge, and Sandra was just another subject, another black person that had to be managed. Sandra was on her knees when Wally suddenly and without notice pushed harder. She gasped for air and held her stomach tight in defense as the impact sent a shock through her body. The tears were burning her eyes as she tried to catch her breath. "Please," she begged. "Please. Stop." Wally yells drowned out hers. "Get down. Stop resisting." He put his hand on her back and tried to pull her all the way to the ground, but Sandra's body was fighting back. It wasn't against him, but against the awkward position and the fear and pain that were about to overwhelm her. As they watched the violence happen in front of them, the people who were watching spoke up more, and their worry turned to anger. "She's not resisting. She's pregnant, man. What's wrong with you?" Someone yelled as they held their phone high to record the whole horrifying scene. There were more people around, but Wally didn't let that stop him. It almost made him want to do better, like he was trying to prove something to himself or to them. He was in charge of this. No one could stand up to him. Not this black woman, not the people watching, not anyone. He looked back at Sandra, who was shaking and trying to stay on her knees, even though her lower back and stomach hurt very badly. Sandra could only think about one thing: her baby. Was everything okay? Could this worry and danger hurt her unborn child? She had to keep it safe and get through this. But how could she, when the person meant to keep her safe was attacking her? Under her breath, I can't breathe," she said, her voice strained from the stress. It was hard for her to breathe because Wally's hand was on top of her tightly. Jones didn't back down, though. As if he couldn't hear her, or even worse, didn't believe her, he seemed to press down even more. As more people saw how bad things were, they felt more confident to speak out. Many people were yelling to get Wally attention and help him understand what was going on. One guy yelled, "Let her go. She didn't do anything." His voice was shaking with anger. But Wally didn't pay attention to the rising protests going on around him. He was too far gone and caught up in his own sense of power to see the harm he was causing. He thought this was just another day, another criminal, and another arrest. He didn't care that Sandra was black and pregnant. It didn't matter that she was human. He was in charge, that was all that counted. Sandra's body was having a hard time handling the pain and fear, so she could barely see. She had no idea how things had gotten so bad. What was going on with her? She had always been good. She worked hard and had a quiet life. But now, one man's blind anger was destroying everything she had worked for. Suddenly, one voice was heard over the others. Someone yelled, "Call for help," and right away, several people had their phones out. Not just recording, but also calling 911 to report the police officer who was meant to be protecting them. Wally paused for the first time, and he looked at the people who were now gathered around him. Things were less tense in the air now. The way they looked at him and judged him made him feel heavy. There was a moment when he let go of Sandra, and she gasped for air and sagged with relief. It wasn't over, though. Wally stood up straight and glared at the crowd. He was still high on power. He yelled, "Back off," and waved his free hand at them. "This is police business. She's under arrest." The crowd didn't believe it. They had seen enough, and their phones were still recording. So they could remember every second of Wally's attack on a pregnant woman who couldn't defend herself. Now that the truth was out, there was no turning back. As time went on, it became clear that Wally's plan for how this would end would not work out. There was mounting disapproval from the crowd, strong proof in their hands, and rising tensions that were beginning to change the course of events. He was no longer in charge. Sandra was still struggling to breathe, and she knew that she needed help right away, because she wasn't sure how much longer her body could handle. Sandra was lying on the cold, rough concrete. Her body was shaking, and she couldn't help but put her hand on her swollen stomach. She felt like lightning was going through her, and it wasn't just fear for herself. There was a strange stillness around her baby, the little life inside her that had just kicked and squirmed. As Officer Wally stood above her and barked orders, her mind was racing with fear. His voice was full of the anger of authority that had been ignored. Time seemed to stand still for the first 10 seconds of this moment. It was hard for her to breathe, and every beating reminded her of how dangerous things were. The fall caused sharp, scary pain that went through her stomach. Wally's eyes were filled with anger, and his face was covered in anger. He didn't seem to understand how serious the situation was. From the moment he saw her, he knew what kind of person she was. Not deserving of kindness or safety, just another thief to catch. It was only a few inches away, but Sandra's phone seemed to be buzzing. She had to get there. While she reached for the phone, she dragged herself across the sidewalk with her free hand. Her fingers scraped against the ground. The crowd behind her was getting bigger, and they were murmuring louder. She could feel the stress in the air. Some people were recording and screaming in protest, but no one was brave enough to get involved physically. They knew what could go wrong. As Wally yelled again, "Stay down. I said stay down." His grip on the baton got tighter, turning his fingers white. He was so angry with himself that his voice cut through the noise. Sandra had no choice but to get up. She finally got a hold of the phone, but her fingers were shaking as she tried to open it. Her heart was racing because she was afraid for her baby's safety. And more. Sure that things were going to get out of hand. She could not let this go on. Not like this. She knew right away which number to press, because she had learned it as a child, and it was for her father. He understands what to do. She could hear the first ringing in her ears, and each second hurt. Could he get it in time? Would he understand how important what was going on was? She gasped and tried to stay focused as another sharp pain shot through her belly. She had to pay attention. People in the crowd kept yelling, and some even screamed at the police officer to stop, but Wally could only see what he was seeing. At least he thought he was in charge. Then, after the third ring, a deep, familiar voice picked up. "Sandra, what's wrong?" Even though her dad's voice was calm, Sandra knew he could tell something wasn't right. He was always aware of her and looked out for her, especially now that the baby is coming. But this time, his voice had a slight edge to it. A quiet determination that made her think she might be safe for a moment. "Dad." Sandra's voice broke as she spoke, her throat getting tight with fear. What could she say about what was going on? The words were stuck in her throat, but she forced them out with shaky breaths. "I'm on the ground. An officer. I need help. I'm scared." The other end of the line went silent, and Sandra knew her dad was thinking. It's not like Chief Wilson was any father. He was a strong man who had worked his way up to become one of the state's most respected police chiefs. No one else could understand how important what she said was. "Sandra," he said in a low voice, the calm before the storm. "Where are you? Tell me exactly where you are." Sandra tried to speak, but her hands were shaking and her breath came in short gasps. Wally was still standing over her, and his voice was like a steady hum in the background. She barely paid attention to what he was saying, though. Her only thought was her father's voice, which was like a tether to her at that moment. She barely got out. "I'm by the road near. Take exit 22. He's not listening, Dad." "He's this time." Her voice broke because she was upset. She was stuck on the last word. She didn't need to. Her dad knew what she meant. Chief Wilson's jaw got tight on the other end of the call. He was very aware of what was going on. Too many times, he had seen this happen on the news, in stories, and even in cases he had done himself. But this was not like that. His daughter, who was pregnant, was lying on the ground, under the boot of a man who didn't know what kind of storm he was letting into his life. "Listen to me, Sandra," Wilson said, in a calm but sharp voice. "Help is coming. Stay as calm as you can. I need you to breathe, okay? Just breathe and hold on. I'm going to be there, you hear me? I'm coming." Sandra said yes, but he couldn't see her. She tried to hold back tears that were welling up in her eyes. She had to be strong for herself, her child, and the people she was trying to protect. His voice was like a lifesaver to her, so she squeezed her phone even tighter. Wally, meanwhile, was still there, and he was getting more angry when he saw Sandra on the phone. He walked up to her and barked, "Who are you calling?" His face turned crazy with doubt, as if asking for help were another way for him to show his disapproval. Sandra didn't answer when I told her to put down the phone. She was unable to answer. Her father was the only person who could save her. The chief told the person on the phone, "I told you I'd send backup right now, and I will be there too. Stay on the line with me and just keep talking." When Wally saw how determined Sandra looked, his eyes got narrow, and for a split second, he had question in his mind. He quickly brushed it off, though. This was his scene. At least that's what he told himself. He was in charge. He couldn't look bad in front of everyone, not now. Sandra tried to move, but the pain in her stomach got worse as she did. Scared for her baby, she tried to keep her breathing regular and pay attention to what her father was saying. In times of trouble, her dad always told her to stay calm and think straight, even when everything was coming apart around her. But this wasn't like that. The tone was private. As she lay there, she started to have her first doubts. Would the fact that her dad was police chief be enough to sway people? Would she get it in time, before Wally made things even worse? Wally moved closer and stood over her again, casting a long shade over her. "Leave her alone," and "She's pregnant," yelled and screamed more people in the crowd, which she could hear. Still, No one did anything about it. Being there in person would only make things worse, so they knew not to do it. The noise was cut off by the voice of a woman in the crowd. The woman screamed. She didn't do anything. Her voice was full of righteous anger. "She's pregnant, for God's sake." Even though Wally turned his head and glared at the voice, the crowd's mood was changing. It was now his turn to be filmed. There were too many eyes on them. He paused for the first time because he wasn't sure what to do next. The people he tried to manage were now putting his power to the test. Could you feel the change in the crowd? It gave Sandra a little hope. There was a chance that things were going her way. Wally might finally give up. He might see that he was going in the wrong direction. He might pay attention. The officer's jaw clenched though, and his grip on his stick got tighter. He was unwilling to give up power. The sound of her dad's voice on the phone came back. This time, it was steady and more urgent. "Sandra, I'm close. I'm 5 minutes away. You stay with me. Don't hang up." Sandra gave a nod and swallowed hard as the minutes went by. She only had 5 minutes left to hold on. We only have 5 minutes left. Could she last for 5 more minutes? Even though her mind was racing, she held on to one thought. Her father was coming. And everything would be different when he got there. The tense air was broken by the sound of coming sirens and the flashing blue and red lights that came from nearby buildings. The officer stood tall and straightened his back as 2 more police cars arrived on the scene. He thought he was safe because backup had come. Sandra felt a rush of fear while she was still lying on the ground, with one hand over her stomach to protect herself. Would they make things worse? It hurt her body from being treated badly, and she was scared for her baby. There were more people in the crowd, and there were more phones recording the event. Wally stole a quick look at them, but didn't seem worried. He didn't care about the picture taking. He thought he was just doing his job. He saw Sandra as just another issue that needed to be resolved. His coworkers would support him, as they always did. As the other cops got out of their car, they took a slow look at what they saw. Sandra, a black woman who looked like she was pregnant, was on the ground shaking in pain. Her face was wet with tears. Wally stood above her with his arms crossed and a strong air about him. As people waited to see what would happen next, they whispered and gasped so hard that they were hard to hear. Wally looked at the police officers and gave them a smug nod. He thought they would follow him because, as always, he thought he had everything under control. But the way they looked told him this wasn't going to be like every other regular stop. It looked like the moment's weight was thick and heavy in the air. A middle-aged man with gray hair was the first officer to approach Wally. He looked quickly at Sandra and then back to Wally. He asked, with a calm, level voice, "What's going on here?" Wally made a face. Resisting arrest, he said straight out. She was acting suspicious, wouldn't cooperate. Typical. The officer looked back at Sandra, who was having a hard time sitting up and her breathing was getting worse. His eyes showed a hint of suspicion. It didn't feel right about this. He looked around at the people and the cameras that were shooting everything. He felt sick to his stomach. He had been through this kind of thing too many times before. He could tell when another cop was using rules to hide something darker. But this time, everyone could see. They had to be careful because everything they did was being watched. The department couldn't afford another scandal right now, because things between the neighborhood and police were already very tense. The second officer, a younger guy with a tense face, also walked up to Wally and looked nervously back and forth between Wally and Sandra. He wasn't as skilled as the others, but he knew something wasn't right. His hand was hovering near his belt, as if he wasn't sure whether to put it on his gun or keep it by his side. This showed that he was uncomfortable. Asking her directly for the first time, "Sandra," the younger cop asked her softly, "Are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" Sandra looked up when she heard the question. This was the first kindness she had seen since Wally pulled her out of her car. She tried to answer, but her voice was shaking. The woman stuttered, I'm pregnant, with one hand still on her belly. Please, I just need help. I haven't done anything wrong. The crowd was now whispering louder, their voices rising with worry and anger. A lot of people agreed and yelled that they had seen everything and Sandra hadn't done anything to earn this. The older cop looked back at Wally with a slightly more serious face. You said you were resisting arrest? He asked again, this time sounding more doubtful. But she's pregnant. What exactly was the threat here? Wally tensed up at the question. He wasn't happy with how things were going. He was expecting quick and questioned support from his coworkers, not to be questioned. He tightened his hold on his belt and shook his head. He spoke in an angry voice. Look, she was acting strange and wouldn't do what I asked. I don't need to explain, miss, if you know how it is. The older cop didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step back and looked over the scene again, this time taking in the crowd, the cameras. Sandra on the ground, and Wally standing over her with anger that was hard to hold back. It didn't make sense. The younger cop moved closer to Sandra while still keeping a close eye on her. He asked softly, Ma'am, can you tell us what happened? Why did this get worse? Jenkins snapped before Sandra could answer. Hey, I've got this under control. Don't undermine me. The younger officer wasn't sure if he should follow Wally's direction or do what was right. But the stress in the air, the people watching, and the thought of Sandra lying on the ground all made him feel bad. He had to deal with it. The crowd became more confident when they saw the backup cops hesitate. They spoke louder and pointed their phones more directly at Wally. Someone in the crowd yelled, She didn't do anything. Another person said, She's pregnant, and you're attacking her for no reason. As one guy in the crowd took a small step forward, his phone was fixed on the scene. This is all being recorded, he said firmly. We saw what happened. We've got proof. Wally's face turned into a snarl, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He stared at the crowd, getting more and more angry. Things were not meant to go this way. He was supposed to be in charge here, boss. Things were changing in terms of power, though. As the backup cops hesitated and the crowd turned against him, the older cop turned back to Wally because it was clear that he didn't like the way things were going. He told her in a strong but quiet voice, You need to calm down. We're not looking for a situation here. Wally's teeth clenched, and his pride was hurt. Before he could answer, though, the sound of tires screaming cut through the noise. As a stylish black SUV pulled up, everyone turned to see who was inside. The tinted windows made it hard to see. There was silence in the crowd because they knew something big was going to happen. Wally made a face and squinted at the car. He didn't think anyone else would show up. Who the hell was this? When the SUV door opened, a tall, big black man in a nice suit stepped out. People paid instant attention to him. There was something about the way he walked and the air of power around him made even the loudest people in the crowd quiet down. When Sandra saw him, her breath got tight. Even though tears were still running down her cheeks, she felt better. Her dad had shown up. As Wally finally recognized the man, his face fell. It was Chief Wilson, who was in charge of the city's police force. Sandra's dad. Wally's confidence dropped when he realized what was going on. He had no idea that he had just hit someone. It was clear that Chief Wilson was angry, but he walked slowly toward the scene of the crime. He didn't look at the crowd or the police. He was only looking at his daughter, who was still on the ground, and the man who was standing over her. The backup cops stepped aside right away because they knew there was a change in power. Wally, on the other hand, stood still, his mind running to figure out how serious things were. He had just hit the daughter of the police chief, and there were cameras everywhere. Chief Wilson got down on his knees next to Sandra and helped her slowly get up. When he talked to her to make sure she was okay, his voice was soft and sweet. It was a quiet question, Are you hurt? Is the baby all right? Sandra nodded through her tears. Having her father here made her feel so much better. "I'm okay, Dad," she whispered. "But he attacked me." These words made Chief Wilson's eyes darken and his jaw tighten. He slowly stood up and turned to face Wally. His face was as steely as his words. The crowd held its breath. The stress was almost too much to handle. They knew Wally was going to have to deal with the results of what he did. Wally tried to talk, but he couldn't get the words out. He stuttered and tried to think of a reason, but what he said now wouldn't matter. Chief Wilson moved closer. His voice was low and screamed with anger that was hard to hold back. A black SUV roared up to the scene, its engine low and threatening against the growing crowd's tense silence. "Explain yourself, Officer Wally." Sandra tried to calm her breathing while lying on the ground in pain. Her hands were shaking as they held her swollen stomach. As the door to the sleek car opened, the late afternoon sun glinted off the shiny metal and made her heart race. A big, tall black man walked out, and everyone around him started to pay attention right away. He wore a dark suit and had a look that was hard to read. His eyes were cold as ice and seemed to stop time for a moment. Sandra's neck tightened as she realized her father had arrived. Officer Wally, the white police officer, who had been roughing up Sandra moments before, was still hovering nearby. He stood straight, as if he was sure of his authority. His hand was resting on his holster, and the threat of his strength was still there. He didn't think anyone important would show up, especially not someone so powerful that they would rock his world. The crowd, which had been growing slowly, whispered as the man walked up. Some knew him from the local news, while others remembered him from when he spoke at press conferences about the safety of the city. It wasn't just anyone. It was Sandra's dad, Chief Wilson, who is the city's police chief. Realizing what was going on changed the mood right away, in the first 10 seconds. But Wally still didn't fully understand who he was dealing with. Instead, he continued to walk slowly toward Sandra, looking around at the new police officers whose cars were parked on either side of the scene, like silent spectators. Wally thought that having more backups gave him more power, and made his story of events more likely to be true. What was strange, though, was that his coworkers weren't looking at him when he looked at them. Wally made a face. The air around him seemed to get tighter because his fellow cops, who had been quick to pay attention to him when they first arrived, didn't seem sure what to do. Wally had no idea what it meant. Wasn't this just a normal stop that went wrong? A simple check that got worse when the black woman wouldn't cooperate. A black woman in a car? Their sudden reluctance made his eyes narrow as he tried to figure out what was going on. A black shade had grown over the street from the SUV, and he looked at it as Chief Wilson walked toward the scene. Even though he didn't change his face, he was looking straight at his daughter. He took his time and walked slowly. There was power in him, so he didn't have to raise his voice or move faster. He got closer to Sandra, who was still on the ground and shaking from fear and pain. The truth was slowly but surely coming into the scene, even though it hadn't been said out loud yet. There was more to Sandra's father than just another worried citizen. He was the boss and had taught all of the police officers here, even Wally, who had no idea who he was beating up on the side of the road. When Chief Wilson got closer, he knelt down and moved slowly and carefully while he checked on Sandra. His big hand lightly touched her shoulder. His voice was worried and angry at the same time. "Sandra," he asked softly, "you okay?" Sandra gave him a weak nod, her eyes showing a mix of fear and relief. "Dad," she said in a shaking whisper, "he hurt me. I swear I didn't do anything." Wilson's jaw got tight. He could tell his daughter was scared when she talked on the phone. But seeing her in real life, weak and scared, made him very angry. How many times did he hear stories like this from victims? They were taught to be better than Thisto, protect, not hurt. Now, he saw his daughter, the person he loved most in the world, lying on the ground like she was a criminal. He slowly got up and turned to face Wally. When they looked at each other, the air seemed to stop moving. Wally's face was smug because he still didn't know how bad his mistake was. "Officer," Wilson said, in a cold, cool voice. "Step away from her now." Wally blinked and raised his lips in a dismissive smirk. "Sir, I've got this under control," he bragged. There was a moment of silence. "She's been resisting arrest and making a disturbance." Wilson's eyes got darker, and the cops nearby looked at each other with unease. Some of them knew who their leader was and were quietly getting ready for what was going to happen. Everyone but Wally could see the truth. It was Chief Wilson's calm voice that had an edge to it now that he said, "Resisting arrest? Is that what you think happened here, Officer Wally?" Wally confidently nodded, still not knowing what was really going on. "That's right," he replied. He continued, "She wasn't compliant. I gave her several warnings, but she refused to follow my instructions. I had to use force to maintain control." Chief Wilson kept his cool and didn't look away. However, his calmness wasn't a comforting one. It was an authoritative calmness that made people understand they were in over their heads. The danger signs were there, but Wally didn't see them. Too much of his faith was rooted in his own ideas about how the world worked. Sandra was just another black lady who needed to be stood up for. He was the police officer in charge. Wilson put out a quiet question and took one step forward. "Do you know who I am, Officer Wally?" Wally raised an eyelid, as if the question didn't matter. He replied, "No, sir. I don't see why that's important here." One more beat of quiet. Their faces were tense as they looked between Wilson and Wally. Wally was clearly making things worse for himself, and there was no way out. Wilson smiled in a small, not funny way. He spoke, "I'm Chief Wilson," and the words shook the air like thunder. "The chief of this department. And that woman you just assaulted? She's my daughter." Wally felt like he had been hit in the gut by the news. His smug look went away right away, and it was replaced by confusion and then fear. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was starting to understand what he had done wrong, but it was too late. The balance of power had changed totally. The people around them started to whisper while they were still recording. Sandra lay on the ground and watched as her dad stood in front of her to protect her from the man who had just attacked her. Finally, Wally found out who he was working with. It hit him like a hammer. Wally stuttered as he tried to get back in charge, but it was too late. "I didn't know," he said, in a weak voice. Wilson cut him off with a sharp look and cold eyes. "I didn't know she was your daughter," he said. "It doesn't matter who she is. What matters is how you treated her. You used unnecessary force on a pregnant woman. You didn't care about her safety or her humanity. That's the issue, Officer Wally." Now, there was silence in the crowd. Everyone felt the weight of the moment. Wally's face had turned pale, and he no longer had the cockiness that had been in every move since he first approached Sandra. His fellow cops didn't defend him because they knew they couldn't. Wilson took a deep breath to calm down. Aside from being angry at Wally, he knew that his anger was about more than just Wally. The people who were supposed to protect black people had been rude to them, and it wasn't just his daughter. It was all black people. He had seen too many cases of this kind of wrongdoing, and now it was happening to him. He spoke to one of the cops nearby in a firm voice. He told the cops, "Get paramedics over here right now to check on my daughter and make sure she's safe." As they rushed to do what he said, Wilson looked back at Wally, who looked like he knew his job was in danger. Now that the truth was out, there was no turning back. Wilson said in a low voice, "You'll answer for this. I'll make sure of it." Wally stood still as the truth of what he had done hit him. The crowd moved and took pictures of everything on their phones. Even though the truth had been told, the effects were just getting started. The officer stood still, his grip on Sandra's arm still tight, even though she wasn't trying to get away. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. The excitement from being arrested too quickly was starting to wear off. In just a few seconds, the mood around him had changed a lot. But he still didn't fully understand what was going on. It was the black SUV that had just pulled up that caught his attention. It seemed to have everyone's full attention. When the back door opened and the tall, scary figure walked out, Wally felt something strange start to happen in his stomach. Chief Wilson, Sandra's father, and the police chief got out of the car within. He had an air of quiet power about him. You couldn't read his face, but his movements were deliberate and slow. Wally blinked. He was having a hard time putting the pieces together. Her dad was the police chief. He looked at his daughter Sandra the whole time. Chief Wilson walked toward her. Time seemed to slow down. At first, he didn't look at the crowd, the other cops, or even Wally. At that moment, Sandra was the only thing that mattered to him. It felt like the air was tense, like right before a storm. Still on the ground, Sandra held her swollen stomach and twisted her face in pain and fear. While seeing her father made her feel better, the mental weight of what had just happened kept her there. It was so hard for her to breathe that tears were running down her face. Chief Wilson got on his knees next to her and put his big hand on her shoulder. "Sandra," he said, in a soft voice that was both cool and worried. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you, or young one?" Sandra was sobbing so hard that she could hardly speak. "Dad, he grabbed me," she said in a shaky voice. He wouldn't pay attention. He said I was fight back, but I wasn't." Wilson's eyes got tight as he listened to what his daughter had to say. He had been a police officer for a long time, and knew the kind of person Officer Wally was. Someone who let their biases lead them and saw a black person as a threat. Especially one who was standing up for themselves. Sandra was in Chief Wilson's eyes the whole time. He told the doctors to come over. "Check her out," he told them in a calm voice. "Make certain that she and the child are safe." The paramedics ran over, being careful as they went. Wally was only a few feet away, and his heart was beating fast. He was starting to understand how serious things were. But he wasn't quite there yet. It was the police chief's daughter who was pregnant. He thought back to the first time he walked up to Sandra's car and heard her angry voice. He was already sure of what she was saying. She had on black clothes and a nice car, so she had to be up to something. He had told himself that story. Now, he understood how wrong he had been. Wally's hand was still hovering near his holster. He hadn't let go of the reaction yet, even though things were less dangerous. He swallowed hard, and sweat started to form on his face. As he looked at the other police officers who had come, he felt tense. They knew they were being watched. First, Chief Wilson got up from where he was kneeling next to Sandra. Then, he looked at Wally for the first time. Wally thought for a moment that the ground beneath him might give way. The chief's eyes were like 1,000 pounds heavy. Wilson walked slowly and carefully toward him. His face was still hidden, and his stance was stiff. But Wally could tell that a storm was coming from below. The other cops, who had come because they thought it was just a normal backup call, stood off to the side, not sure what to do. They knew this wasn't going to happen again. He opened his mouth to talk, to try to explain, to defend what had happened, but nothing came out. Even though his mind was racing, he just couldn't think of a way to spin this now. Not with the police chief standing in front of him, the cameras, the phones held up by the crowd, and the whispers of the people watching him, closing in on him like a trap. "Officer Wally," Chief Wilson told him in a low, threatening voice, "get away from my daughter." Wally paused just a bit too long, and Wilson only had to see that his hand was still twitching near his gun. The chief looked down at Wally's hand, and his face turned serious. "Get out of the way." Wilson said it again, and this time, his voice cut through the stress like a knife. Finally, Wally took a step back. He raised his hands in front of him to show that he didn't mean any harm. His heart was beating fast, and he felt a little fear for the first time. He hadn't planned for things to turn out this way. Wally stuttered, "I didn't know." The words came out of his mouth awkwardly. "I had no idea who she was. I believed she was." "What did you think she was, Wally?" Chief Wilson spoke up, and his voice was cold and in charge. You thought she was just another black woman you could control? You thought she wouldn't fight back and would be easy to scare? Wally quickly blinked, and with each word, the truth of his mistake hit him harder. He thought he was in charge because he thought his badge gave him power over everyone there. He never thought about the fact that this time, he wasn't the powerful one, though. Wally started to say, "I didn't mean," but the chief cut him off again. "No, Wally, you didn't think. That is the issue. You didn't think at all. You thought the worst when you saw my daughter. You thought she was dangerous because she was black. You thought you were free to treat her however you pleased." The other cops did not say anything because they were afraid to speak up. They all knew where this was going, and they didn't want to be Wally right now. Chief Wilson took another step forward. His voice was now low and quiet, which could be dangerous. "Think about what might have came up today." He looked at Wally with fire in his eyes and asked, "Do you know how close you were to hurting my daughter and my grandchild?" Wally lost his taste for food. The weight of what he had done was pushing down on him like a blanket, making it hard to breathe. No matter how much training, authority, or badge he had, it didn't matter when he was facing the man who was much stronger than he thought possible. Wally spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Chief. I did not mean for things to get out of hand. I had no idea she was." Chief Wilson cut him off with a stern look. He finally lost his cool for a moment when he said, "You didn't need to know who she was. There was no need to know she was my daughter for you to be decent to her. I see where you went wrong, Wally. You did not do your job as an officer or as a person." Wally was speechless as the chief's words hung in the air. He had no way to defend himself or explain what he had done. In an instant, his power had been taken away, and he was now standing in the mess of what he had done. After taking a step back, Chief Wilson's rage was back under control. It was the other cop's turn to look at what was going on. The chief said, in a quiet voice, "Arrest him." There was no way to argue with that. The officers thought about it for a second before going forward to follow through. He was shocked when he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around his wrists. It was time for Wally to leave, and Chief Wilson turned back to Sandra, who was now being checked out by paramedics. He felt relieved when he saw that she and the baby were okay. But he was still angry, frustrated, and deeply hurt. Sandra looked at her dad with tears in her eyes, but she was also thankful. Not having him there on time could have led to bad things. She knew that. She knew that the ending of this story could have been very different. As she saw Wally being led away, she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over yet. As Chief Wilson walked up to Officer Wally, he stood tall, and his face showed that he was angry, but not outburst. The moment seemed strange. Wally had been in charge just a few minutes ago, barking orders and hitting Sandra without thinking twice. Now, there was a lot of stress in the air, and everyone's attention was on the two men, the attacker and the victim's father. It was very quiet for the first few seconds between them. Wally had moved back a little to keep his power, but it was quickly slipping away. His outfit used to be a sign of his strength. But now that he knew what was going on, it felt like a heavy weight. This wasn't a normal meeting. Each and every police officer on the scene knew that the man in front of him wasn't just a worried dad, but the chief of police. There was anger in Chief Wilson's eyes, but he kept it in check. His jaw was tight, even though he hadn't said anything yet. Just being there made it clear that Wally was in big trouble. While she was still sitting on the ground, Sandra watched the scene play out through tears. The group of people watching had grown, and their phones were raised to record every moment of this scene. As people waited for the storm to end, there was a dead silence. The chief finally spoke. His voice was calm, but had a tone of power that made no one argue. What did Officer Wally do here? When he spoke, his tone seemed calm, but there was clear danger underneath it. Wally failed for the first time. His hand went straight to his belt, as if he was looking for reassurance from his badge or gun or anything that would tell him of his place. Now, though, The weight of the badge didn't seem important in light of what was going on. Things were not meant to go this way. He had been hoping for support and unity from his fellow soldiers. They didn't want to look at Chief Wilson, so they stood behind him and were quiet. Wally took a deep breath and tried to keep his voice calm. "She was refusing to be arrested, sir. I was following the rules." Even he thought his words were weak. His excuses were weak, like a defense that was falling apart, in front of someone who knew the scheme better than anyone else. Wilson, the chief, moved closer and his eyes got narrow. How to do it? Even though his speech was low, it had a clear edge to it. "So you thought it was okay to drag a pregnant woman to the ground?" Wally could feel a cold sweat on the back of his neck. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. How could he explain this? He had done what he did out of habit, and because of a bias he had never thought about before. He saw Sandra as just another black suspect. Not a person with her own life, but someone to rule. "I asked you a question," Chief Wilson said, with a stronger voice. "Why did you make things worse? Why did you hit a pregnant woman with force?" Wally was lost and looked around for help from his fellow cops, but no one stepped up to help him. They stood there like statues, not moving, because they knew that supporting Wally at this point would be bad for their careers. It wasn't just another normal event. It was a historic moment that happened during the day in front of a growing crowd, with cell phones recording every second of it. Wally stuttered, I didn't know she was pregnant." The words came out badly. She wasn't following through. And I wasn't following through. Chief Wilson spoke up and cut the conversation off. It was clear that he was very angry from the cold in his eyes. "Officer Wally, what about her acts made you think she was dangerous? Did the fact that she had her hands up make it worse? Was it that she told you over and over that she was pregnant?" He opened his mouth and then shut it again. When he tried to make reasons, he knew they were weak and wouldn't hold up under Chief Wilson's questioning. The police officer's mind was racing as he desperately tried to think of something, anything, that would make his actions okay. There was nothing, though. Chief Wilson's face became more serious. As he got closer, his huge body cast a long shade over Wally. "Let me be clear about something," Wilson said, in a low voice that was almost raging with anger. "It doesn't matter who you are, what you think you saw, or what your biases tell you. You hurt my pregnant daughter because you thought you could get away with it because she is black." Wally jerked when he heard the words because they were so harsh. Not only was there no misunderstanding, but there was also no way to get out of it. By saying that someone felt attacked or suspected danger, that was pure bias that made him do what he did. And now, it was coming back to hurt him in the worst way possible. "I swear, Chief, I didn't know." Williams cut Wally off with a sharp voice when he tried again. "Didn't know what, Officer Wally?" Wilson asked as he got closer. "That she was my daughter? Or that your race or bias was clear?" Every word the crowd said made the stress rise. As a father and as the head of the police force, this was the moment they had all been waiting for. The strong man in front of them would demand accountability. The police force was about to fall apart because of the actions of one officer. Wally's mouth was dry, and he had a lot of ideas going through his head. Under Chief Wilson's sharp gaze, he had lost the confidence and power that came with wearing his uniform. When he pulled Sandra over on the side of the road, he had no idea that this would happen. He had seen her as just another victim, another body to abuse. He did not think much of her or her father, which was even worse. Chief Wilson stood up straight, and his voice became calm again, but this time it had the weight of certainty in it. "Wally, you had no reason to make things worse. There was no reason to touch my daughter or treat her badly the way you did. You just saw her skin color and thought you could do whatever you wanted." Wally could feel the pain in his chest from those words. They couldn't stand the silence that had been building between them for what seemed like hours. Each second felt heavier than the last. Wally told the man, "I didn't mean for this to happen, sir. but the man didn't believe him. So many times before, excuses like, "I felt threatened," or "she wasn't complying" worked. But now, they didn't. He wasn't ready for how quickly the world around him was changing. The eyes of Chief Wilson got narrow. "You didn't mean for this to happen?" he asked again and again, his voice full of contempt. "Officer, what did you really mean to happen? Did you think my daughter would be scared and give in because you told her to? Were you sure that no one was looking? No cameras? Not many people? Did you think the system would keep you safe like it always has?" Wally's heart was beating fast. It was like getting hit in the gut with every word. His whole life, he thought that the system would protect him, and that his acts would be okay as long as he could explain them. But this time was different. The person he was dealing with this time wasn't just any person. It was the daughter of the police chief. It was impossible to read Chief Wilson's face, but his eyes were cold and determined. He said, in a steady, quiet voice, "Here's what's going to happen, Wally. You'll have to deal with the results of what you did, just like everyone else. I will see that justice is done, not just for my daughter, but for everyone you've hurt in this way." Wally had a wave of sickness hit him. That was it, the line was over. There was no way to get back on track. Chief Wilson took a step back and turned his attention to the cop standing nearby. The crowd was stunned into silence. Wilson told them, "Arrest Officer Wally." His voice was strong. "For assault." The cops, who were stunned, moved quickly to help. As the crowd started to move, they quickly put Wally in handcuffs. Wally knew that the balance of power had changed a lot. He was no longer in charge. Now, he was being pulled away and had to deal with the results of what he had done. As Wally was taken away, the crowd started to cheer. For the first time in his career, their voices rose in a wave of victory. Records were made on phones all the time, so everyone could see what was happening. Things were fair, at least for now. But what happened would leave Sandra and Chief Wilson with scars that would last long after the camera stopped rolling. Still scared, Sandra watched as her father stood tall, his face hard but determined. She was now surrounded by rescuers. She was sure the fight was far from over. But she did feel a bit of hope. At this very moment, he stood up for her, which was something that many other people hadn't done. As Sandra leaned against the side of the ambulance, the doctors checked her pulse slowly. The air was tense. Even though the air was cool, her heart was still beating fast from the excitement, fear, and shock of what had just happened. That wasn't meant to happen to her, not to Chief Wilson's daughter, the man who was respected and trusted all over the city. Officer Wally didn't care about any of that when he first saw her across the scene. She knew as she sat there. A large group of people had gathered, and most of them had their phones up to record the drama that had made a normal traffic stop into a worldwide event. All eyes were on them. People in the crowd got more shocked and angry when they found out who her father was and how Wally's job wasn't enough to stop the racist assumptions he made about him. The racist attack Wally had made was now clear to see, and there was no going back. When Officer Wally stood still, he looked back and forth between Chief Wilson and the other police who were waiting for orders. Wally's face turned pale as the weight of what he'd done started to sink in. He had lost all the confidence he had shown earlier. He was not only facing a report, but also the anger of his boss. Chief Wilson stood a few feet away from Wally. It was hard to read his face, but he was strong. He moved slowly and carefully toward Wally, like a hunter getting a feel for its game. People paid attention when Sandra's dad raised his voice, which wasn't often. He didn't even have to yell today. His cold, steady look said it all. The crowd went silent when Chief Wilson stopped in front of Wally and stood tall. The chief didn't say anything for a long, tense moment. He just stood there and looked at the man who had the nerve to touch his daughter. Everyone was waiting for the chief to speak, but no one knew what he would say next. The quiet was unbearable. "You're going to tell me Chief Wilson said in a low but strong voice. Why? You thought it was okay to touch a pregnant woman. The most important question is why you thought it was okay to touch my daughter. Wally felt like he was hit hard by the words. He stuttered and opened and closed his mouth, but he couldn't say anything clear. His thoughts were going fast. He couldn't get away with what he did. There was no reason, and now that the whole city was watching, there was no way out. Sir, Tu didn't know who she was. Wally stuttered, trying very hard to get his words back. He put up his hands to defend himself, and his eyes were wide with fear. I didn't know she was your daughter. The chief looked at him sharply and cut him off. She shouldn't matter, he said, in a cold voice. What matters is that she's a human being, a woman, and you treated her like she was a criminal simply because of the color of her skin. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. It was becoming clear what was going on. Nothing he did could be used as a reason to save him. He did things because they were racist, and now he was facing the results, which were much worse than he had thought. I've known about you, Wally, Chief Wilson said in a steady voice. I have heard the complaints and stories about how you behave. I didn't care though. If they were trained and watched, I thought it could be fixed. But it's clear I was wrong. Wally forced a deep breath in, his heart beating fast in his chest. He could feel that everyone was looking at him and judging him. No longer was he in charge. He realized for the first time how badly he had been wrong about everything. Chief Wilson made a hand motion to the other cops, and his face turned serious. Cuff him, he told them. The police officers looked at each other and then decided not to do it. Wally used to be one of them, but now, the balance of power had changed, and they knew they couldn't stop what had to happen. As the police slowly moved toward Wally, they took off his bonds. Wally jerked and naturally took a step back. Wait, he yelled, you can't do this, as his voice got angrier. I was doing my job. Your job? The voice of Chief Wilson was cold. Your job was to protect and serve, not to attack innocent people, not to harass women, not to act on the worst kind of hate. The crowd agreed, and you could feel their anger. Things were getting tighter around Wally. He could feel the walls closing in on him. His job was over, and his. He hurt his own image because he couldn't get past his own biases. Wally made one last frantic plea as the police closed in. That wasn't what I meant. I thought she was trying to flee the police. Chief Wilson shook his head and kept his eyes on her. Stop talking, he ordered, and his voice had the weight of a judge giving a sentence. Anything you say from here on out will only make things worse for you. Wally's hands were cuffed with chains that clicked into place. The officer who used to be sure of himself and easily used his power against others was now helpless. The crowd cheered, and the sounds they made were a mix of joy and justice. It was too common for them to see times like this when people in power would pick on and hurt black people. It was fair this time, though. This time, things were different. Sandra stayed safe in the back of the ambulance and watched what was going on while her hands rested on her belly. She had a strange mix of feelings, including happiness, fear, and anger. She always knew that because her father was in a place of power, she was somewhat safe, but Wally still attacked her. For some, like Wally, the fact that she was black made her less human. Wally was led to a ready police car with a sad face. Chief Wilson then turned around and walked back toward Sandra. He calmed down as he walked up to her, kneeled down next to her, and took her hand. His voice had been cold and commanding before, but now it was filled with fatherly worry. Are you okay, sweetheart? He asked her softly, looking at her face to see if she looked upset. Sandra said yes, but her voice was a little shaky. She said in a whisper, I'm okay now. I just couldn't believe it was happening. She thought she broke off because she was so upset. I thought he was going to hurt me, Dad. Really hurt me. Chief Wilson's face turned red again, but this time, he did it with the protective sense of a parent. He said, no one will hurt you. Not while I'm here. Never again. While Sandra squeezed his hand and thanked him for being strong, she couldn't get rid of her fears. Wally was not an outlier. He was part of a system that had been going after people like her for generations. She knew that this wasn't the last time she'd faced this kind of hate, even though her father was powerful. As the police car drove off with Wally in the back seat, the crowd started to break up. The event was caught on many phones and was ready to be shared with the world. It was more than just an event. It was a sign of something bigger. Sandra kept her hands on her stomach as she watched the car drive off down the road. Even though she knew she would be okay, this day would leave her with scars that would last a long time. She felt a wave of thanks as she looked at her father, who was still standing guard over her. But she also felt something deeper, a strong desire to fight back against the system that let guys like Wally live. As the city's sun went down, long shadows fell across the street. Sandra knew that this moment, which would be caught on video and seen by everyone, would lead to protests, talks, and maybe even change. She knew the fight wasn't over, though. There was justice for now, but the fight for equality would go on. Tomorrow? Let me know in the comments section what interests you the most in this story. It takes me lots of time to put this story together for you. Kindly leave a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel and share this video. Also, check out our channel for more stories like this. Let's meet over there.